wedding ring was found on the floor, a faint smear of lipstick on the doorframe, and a broken vase lay on the ground, its shards scattered like shattered trust. The quiet town of Millfield had never seen anything like it. The night was meant to be another typical evening in a small neighborhood, but inside the Winters home, the world was crashing down. Mark Winters, once a proud and respected businessman, had discovered his wife, Jessica, in a way he could never unsee. Caught in a web of lies, an affair with the man he called his closest friend, Tom Everett. What happened next would send shockwaves through the tight-knit community. No one could have anticipated the deadly twist that Mark would soon unleash. His rage, fueled by years of marital neglect and a deep betrayal, set into motion a series of actions so calculated that it left no trace until the body was discovered. The police arrived at the scene of the crime, and the house was eerily silent. What had started as a domestic betrayal had escalated into something much darker. The man, who had once been known for his generosity, his loyalty, was now a prime suspect in the death of the man he once called a friend. In the blink of an eye, Mark Winters' life was shattered, and the town of Millfield would never be the same. Millfield was the type of town where everyone knew each other, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. The streets were lined with rows of neatly kept houses, where picket fences and manicured lawns were a mark of pride. Life here moved at a gentle pace, and the biggest events in town were the annual fairs or school graduations. People lived there. Lives tucked away behind closed doors, with the comfort of knowing their neighbors, their secrets, and their pasts. At the heart of Millfield lived Mark Winters, 42 years old, and his wife Jessica, 39. Mark was the owner of a successful local car dealership, a well-liked and respected figure in town. He had built his life on a reputation of integrity and hard work. Jessica, on the other hand, was a stay-at-home wife with a reputation for kindness. The two had been married for 15 years, but recently the cracks in their seemingly perfect marriage were becoming too wide to ignore. Mark had noticed subtle changes in Jessica's behavior, late nights, unexplained absences, and a growing distance between them. But he dismissed his suspicions, convincing himself that it was just stress. Little did he know, the betrayal Jessica had been hiding from him would soon unravel their entire world. And it wouldn't just shatter their marriage, it would change the lives of everyone around them. The night began like any other. Mark Winters came home from his dealership after a long day, expecting to share a quiet evening with his wife, Jessica. The couple had planned to enjoy a simple dinner and perhaps catch up on some much-needed time together. But as he stepped inside the house, something was immediately wrong. The air felt heavy, as though it was charged with an unseen tension. The house, which was usually warm and welcoming, felt cold and unsettling. Mark called out for Jessica, but there was no response. The silence stretched on, more unnerving with each passing second. The house, which had always been a place of comfort and security, suddenly felt like a trap. As he walked through the foyer, he noticed the faint scent of perfume lingering in the air, Jessica's favorite scent. But something was off. He could hear muffled voices coming from the living room. A sudden, chilling realization washed over him. He knew Jessica had been distant, but the truth was far worse than anything he had imagined. With a trembling hand, Mark reached for the door to the living room. What he saw next would forever alter the course of his life. There, on the couch, was Jessica, her arms draped around Tom Everett, Mark's best friend. The two were locked in an embrace, a scene that shattered everything Mark had believed about his marriage. The man he had trusted, the man who had been by his side for years, was now in his arms. His rage flared, a combination of hurt, disbelief, and fury. He stood frozen, unable to process the image in front of him. For a brief moment, neither Jessica nor Tom noticed him. It was as if time itself had stopped. But when their eyes met, it was clear. There was no turning back. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark's thoughts raced. He felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his heart pounding in his chest. His instinct was to confront them, to demand answers, to make sense of what had just been exposed. But the rage boiling inside him drowned out every coherent thought. What should have been an open discussion turned into something far darker. In a blur of motion, Mark lunged toward Tom, his hands trembling as he reached for something. A piece of furniture, anything to channel the overwhelming feeling of betrayal. Tom, startled, stood up, but not fast enough. Mark's mind was clouded with anger, his every thought focused on the wrongs he had just discovered. In a split second, a decision was made. Mark grabbed the glass vase sitting on the coffee table and hurled it at Tom. The vase shattered upon impact, the sound echoing through the room. But the violence did not stop there. In his rage, Mark pushed Tom back, and the two men struggled. There was a desperation in Mark's actions, something primal that overtook his senses. Tom, caught off guard and trying to defend himself, pushed back, but Mark's fury was all-consuming. Amid the chaotic struggle, Jessica screamed. Her voice sliced through the tension in the room. "Mark, stop!" she cried. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. In the heat of the moment, Mark pushed Tom hard against the wall and Tom collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Mark stood over him, chest heaving, the weight of his actions settling in. The room was now a mess. Broken glass, toppled furniture, and the lifeless body of the man who had once been his best friend. In that moment, it wasn't just the betrayal of his wife that Mark had to contend with. It was the realization that the violence he had unleashed was irreversible. He had gone too far. He had crossed a line. Panic set in. Mark looked down at Tom's motionless body, his mind racing. He checked Tom's pulse. It was faint, but there. In a split second, Mark had to decide what to do next. The urge to flee, to avoid the consequences of his actions, tugged at him. But a part of him knew that no matter what, he couldn't undo what had just happened. Jessica, still standing in shock, whispered, "What have you done?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, he turned and fled the house, leaving behind the two people who had just shattered his world. As Mark ran into the night, he knew that what he had done could never be hidden. The violent confrontation, the shock of discovery, the unraveling of a once perfect life, it would all come to light. He had crossed a point of no return, and now he was racing against time, trying to outrun the consequences of his own actions. The chaos that had unfolded in the Winters' home did not end with Mark's hasty departure. As the minutes ticked by, the situation inside the house became more and more dire. Jessica stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with disbelief, staring at Tom's unconscious body. The once celebrated best man, now a victim of Mark's rage, lay crumpled on the floor, blood staining his shirt. It didn't take long for Jessica to snap out of her daze. Panicked, she dialed 911, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. She was barely coherent as she described what had happened, but her message was clear. "My husband. He's hurt Tom. He pushed him. I don't know what to do." The dispatcher remained calm, advising her to stay on the line while paramedics were dispatched to the scene. Minutes later, the quiet suburban street was filled with flashing lights, the screech of sirens cutting through the stillness of the night. When the paramedics arrived, they rushed to Tom's side, immediately assessing the damage. Despite their best efforts, Tom Everett was declared dead at the scene. His injuries were severe, including a head wound that had caused massive trauma to his brain. The fight had been brutal, and the consequences were clear. Mark Winters had killed his best friend. The police arrived soon after, securing the area and beginning their investigation. Detective Olivia Harris, a seasoned investigator, with years of experience in dealing with high-stakes cases, was assigned to the case. She was no stranger to the dark undercurrents of domestic drama, but this case was different. The details were already shocking, and it was clear that the death of Tom Everett wasn't just a random act of violence. This was personal. It had been a crime born of betrayal, fueled by jealousy, and played out in the confines of a once happy home. As Detective Harris began her investigation, she focused on the sequence of events leading up to the death. The first and most glaring question was why Mark Winters had attacked his best friend in such a violent manner. The crime scene provided some answers: broken glass from the vase, overturned furniture, and signs of a struggle. There was no sign of forced entry into the house, no indication that anyone else had been involved. The crime, it seemed, had unfolded in the living room, within the walls of the home Mark shared with his wife. Jessica, still shaken by the events, was interviewed by the police. She confirmed the affair, her voice heavy with regret and shame as she explained that it had been an ongoing relationship with Tom for several months. She admitted to keeping the affair a secret from Mark, fearing his reaction and the fallout it would cause. When asked about the confrontation between Mark and Tom, Jessica described the moment Mark had entered the room, saw them together, and immediately lashed out. She confirmed that Mark had not only attacked Tom but had pushed him violently, sending him crashing into the wall before the fatal blow was struck. But Jessica's account didn't explain everything. Mark had fled the scene, disappearing into the night, leaving Tom's lifeless body behind. Detective Harris knew that the key to understanding the crime lay in Mark's whereabouts after the attack. Where had he gone? What had driven him to such extremes? A breakthrough came when the police discovered that Mark had been in contact with a local mechanic, someone who had worked with him on his car dealership. The mechanic had received a phone call from Mark shortly after the incident occurred. The phone records showed that Mark had asked the mechanic for help, claiming that he needed to get out of town and lay low for a while. This was a significant lead. Mark had been planning to run. He had known that what he had done was unforgivable, and he was trying to escape the consequences. With this new information, Detective Harris focused on tracking down Mark. The investigation team started canvassing nearby areas, looking for any signs of him. They discovered that Mark had been using cash to pay for services, taking deliberate steps to cover his tracks. But no one could have predicted where Mark would be found. It was a call from a small motel on the outskirts of town that finally led to Mark's capture. A clerk at the motel had recognized him from a surveillance video, and within hours, Mark was taken into custody. He was found disheveled and emotionally distant, but his arrest was uneventful. He said very little as he was escorted into the police car, the weight of his actions now sinking in. Back at the Winters home, investigators continued to comb through the crime scene. They collected forensic evidence, including fingerprints, traces of blood, and DNA samples. The scene itself told a grim story of a violent altercation. It was clear that Mark's attack on Tom had not been spontaneous. It had been fueled by deep resentment and emotional turmoil. The more investigators uncovered, the more it seemed like Mark had planned his actions in a cold, calculated way. Detective Harris also discovered a troubling pattern in Mark's past. There had been whispers of domestic tension between him and Jessica, but nothing concrete had ever surfaced. Still, it became apparent that Mark's behavior had grown increasingly erratic leading up to the wedding. A history of controlling behavior and growing distrust of Jessica made it clear that the emotional pressure had been building for some time. The next key development in the investigation came when detectives discovered a series of angry messages between Mark and Tom that had been sent over the months leading to the wedding. These messages revealed that Mark had suspected something was going on between Tom and Jessica long before the affair was uncovered. The messages became more hostile, and the tone shifted from frustration to outright rage as Mark realized his worst fear was becoming reality. As Detective Harris pieced together the evidence, the full scope of Mark Winters' betrayal and his subsequent violence became clearer. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a tragic culmination of years of emotional instability, jealousy, and betrayal. The wedding celebration had been the final straw, the moment Mark's anger boiled over. Just as it seemed the investigation was reaching its inevitable conclusion, a crucial twist came to light that would alter the entire trajectory of the case. While the evidence against Mark Winters appeared solid, there was one key detail that Detective Harris had overlooked: the involvement of a third party. This third party, a name that had never surfaced during initial interviews, would reveal a far more complex motive behind Tom's death. It all started with a routine check of Mark's financial records. Detective Harris had been looking for any additional evidence that might explain the murder. What she discovered was shocking. There were multiple transactions from Mark's bank account that were made to a separate, undisclosed account, an account under the name of Alex Riley. The amount transferred was substantial, far more than the typical payments for his business or personal expenses. Curious about this unknown person, Detective Harris dug deeper into Alex Riley's background, quickly realizing that the connection to the case was far more troubling than anyone could have imagined. Alex Riley was not just some random acquaintance. He was a former associate of Tom Everett from years earlier. Both men had been involved in a series of risky business ventures, including shady investments in the local real estate market. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Tom and Alex had a falling out over a large financial deal gone wrong. The deal had resulted in severe losses, leaving Alex bitter and vengeful. But how did Mark Winters fit into this picture? The breakthrough came when Detective Harris learned that Mark had not only known about Tom and Alex's troubled business history, but had actually been involved in their scheme. Unbeknownst to Jessica, Mark had been privy to all the deals and was deeply entangled in the financial mess. It turned out that Mark had been using his wife's trust and reputation as a way to launder money for the two men, a scheme that had gone unnoticed by the town for years. When the deal failed, Mark found himself in financial ruin, and Tom's affair with Jessica had only exacerbated the pressure. David, who had been married to Jessica for years, had been aware of the illicit dealings and was determined to keep his role in the mess a secret. The motive for murder, in this case, had grown far more intricate than the emotional breakdown of a man betrayed by his wife's affair. Mark Winters wasn't just a husband scorned. He was a man driven to violence by a combination of personal betrayal and financial destruction. In a new wave of revelations, Detective Harris discovered that Mark had planned the murder for weeks. The affair had been the tipping point, but the deeper betrayal came when he realized the extent of the financial scheme that had drained his resources and put him at odds with Tom and Alex. As Mark's financial situation worsened, he had grown more desperate. The wedding, which should have been a joyful occasion, became his final opportunity to regain control and punish the people he felt had wronged him. The most shocking piece of the puzzle came when Detective Harris uncovered a series of texts between Mark and Alex Riley, dating back to the weeks leading up to the wedding. These texts revealed that Alex had been urging Mark to take action, urging him to confront Tom and eliminate the threat before it spiraled further out of control. Mark, ever the loyal husband, had believed that by getting rid of Tom, he could salvage both his marriage and his finances. But it was Alex's urging that pushed him to violence, convincing him that this was the only way to save face and preserve his reputation in the town. The plot twist had shifted everything. The murder of Tom Everett was no longer a simple act of passion. It was the result of a calculated, deliberate scheme involving financial motives, criminal ties, and years of secrecy. Mark Winters had been driven by more than just love and betrayal. He had been caught in a web of financial desperation that left him willing to go to extreme lengths to cover his tracks. His anger toward Tom was no longer just the result of an affair, but of the unraveling of his entire world. And there was more. The investigation uncovered that the murder of Tom had been intended to appear as a crime of passion, a spontaneous outburst triggered by the affair. But with this new information, Detective Harris knew that Mark had carefully set the scene, choosing the wedding night for its chaos and confusion, making it the perfect cover for his crime. He had wanted the murder to look like a tragic consequence of emotional turmoil, all while knowing that it would mask the true nature of his financial ruin. The shocking revelations about Mark Winter's motive sent shockwaves through the small town of Millfield, and as the case against him unfolded in court, the tension in the community reached a boiling point. What had seemed like a straightforward act of jealousy had morphed into something far darker: financial desperation, criminal conspiracy, and cold-blooded murder. Now, Mark Winters was about to face the full force of the legal system. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Word of the case had spread quickly, and it was clear that the people of Millfield were hungry for justice. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rachel Stone, was prepared to present a powerful case. They had uncovered evidence that Mark's actions were not impulsive or fueled by mere emotion, but part of a calculated plan to regain control over his life. The death of Tom Everett had been orchestrated with precision, and the emotional betrayal of his wife had been compounded by the looming financial disaster that Mark had tried to conceal. The prosecution's argument was clear. Mark Winters had murdered Tom Everett not just out of rage over the affair, but to eliminate a financial liability and silence a man who knew too much about his involvement in criminal activities. The prosecution detailed how Mark's financial ruin and his relationship with Alex Riley had pushed him to the brink. They painted a picture of a man desperate to protect his reputation, his wealth, and his secrets at any cost. The prosecution presented compelling evidence. The texts between Mark and Alex Riley, urging him to take action against Tom, were key to understanding the premeditated nature of the crime. The jury was shown records of the substantial money transfers between Mark and Alex, revealing how deep the financial ties were and how intertwined Mark's personal and criminal life had become. The broken vase, the bloodstains, and the violent struggle in the Winters' living room were all presented as part of the calculated scene Mark had crafted to conceal his true intentions. Mark's defense team, led by attorney Simon Brooks, attempted to downplay the severity of the situation. They argued that Mark had been overcome by his emotions after discovering the affair. Brooks suggested that Mark had never intended to kill Tom, but that the confrontation had spiraled out of control. He painted Mark as a man pushed to his limits, a victim of emotional turmoil who, in a moment of weakness, made a tragic mistake. However, the defense struggled to counter the mountain of evidence stacked against Mark. The chilling detail of the calculated murder, how Mark had planned Tom's death under the guise of a passionate outburst, made it clear to the jury that this was no accident. Mark's attempt to disguise the murder as the result of a jealous fit of rage did not hold up in the face of the meticulous planning revealed by the prosecution. The key witness for the prosecution was Jessica Winters, who was called to the stand. Her testimony was crucial. Jessica had, for months, lived a life of secrecy and betrayal, but now, in the courtroom, she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. She was asked to recount the events leading up to the murder, her affair with Tom, and Mark's behavior in the days before the wedding. It was clear that her own actions had played a significant role in the events that led to Tom's death. While she was not charged, her involvement painted a picture of how her relationship with Tom had unwittingly contributed to the downfall of her marriage, and ultimately to the death of her lover. Despite the emotional weight of her testimony, Jessica's revelations provided the prosecution with the missing piece of the puzzle. She confirmed that Mark had been acting strangely in the days before the wedding, hinting at financial troubles and the possibility of losing everything. She described Mark as a man who had grown more controlling and secretive, though she had no idea the extent to which his criminal activities had grown. Jessica's honesty in the courtroom painted a portrait of a man consumed by fear of losing everything: his wife, his business, and his reputation. As the trial neared its climax, both the prosecution and defense delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of Mark's actions, his financial desperation, and his cold manipulation of those around him. They argued that Mark had murdered Tom Everett not as a result of emotional outbursts, but as part of a broader plan to safeguard his secrets. They urged the jury to return a guilty verdict based on the overwhelming evidence of premeditated murder. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Mark was not a cold-blooded killer, but a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. They urged the jury to show leniency, pointing to Mark's previous good character and the emotional devastation he had suffered upon discovering his wife's affair. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. The courtroom was tense as the judge read the decision: guilty of second-degree murder. The jury found that while Mark had not planned the murder to the extent the prosecution had suggested, his actions were still those of a man driven by uncontrollable rage and desperation. The charge of first-degree murder was not upheld, as the jury believed there was insufficient evidence to prove Mark had fully premeditated the killing. Mark Winters was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. His life, once defined by success and respect in the town, had been shattered in an instant. The town of Millfield, once a place of quiet normalcy, had been forever changed by the brutal act of violence that had occurred within its borders. And as for Jessica, she was left to pick up the pieces of her life, the weight of her actions hanging over her like a dark cloud. Her affair, her betrayal, and the death of Tom Everett would forever be tied to her name. The sentencing of Mark Winters brought a conclusion to a case that had captivated the small town of Millfield. The shocking murder of Tom Everett, a crime rooted in betrayal, jealousy, and financial desperation, had forever changed the lives of everyone involved. Mark, once a well-respected businessman, was now facing a long prison sentence for his role in the violent death of his best friend. His actions, driven by a toxic mix of emotions and fear, had led him down a path of irreversible destruction. For Jessica Winters, the consequences were equally devastating. While she wasn't charged with any crime, the affair and its aftermath had left a permanent mark on her life. The relationship she had with Tom Everett, though shrouded in secrecy, had spiraled into a deadly conclusion. Jessica was left to grapple with her own role in the events that led to Tom's death, knowing that her actions had unknowingly fueled the fire of Mark's rage. The town, too, was left to process the tragic turn of events, a close-knit community forever fractured by the secrets that had been uncovered. As the dust settled, Millfield could no longer be the same place it once was. Trust was broken, friendships destroyed, and lives changed forever. The case left everyone wondering, how far can betrayal push someone? What are the true costs of unspoken resentments and hidden lives? In the end, the death of Tom Everett wasn't just about the violent outburst of a husband wronged. It was about a man who, through a web of lies, deceit, and financial ruin, sought revenge on the one person who had betrayed him. The true cost of Mark Winters' revenge was far more than a life lost. It was the unraveling of an entire community,